Okay, so I think slowly but surely we'll get started. Welcome to all of you. I'm really happy that you all could make it and that this conference is actually happening, because there was such a long time before of organizing this, so many emails that we exchanged, and I'm really happy to now see some faces to those names in the emails, and I hope we'll also have the time to talk and get to know each other. I have to make a few announcements, but also I wanted to just very briefly kind of say, just briefly say how we got to this conference, or what the idea was, and also maybe what we expect or what we hope this conference will bring out. And for this, I thought maybe I'd just share a personal story, which is how I personally got to this topic, which is kind of a psychological drama in 3 acts, because I started the PhD here at Scuola Normale exactly 3 years ago in November 2016. And I hadn't chosen a definite subject yet, so I was kind of, wanted to do something about social movements, something with populism maybe, and so on, but I didn't really have a clue what to do. And yeah, you know what happened in November 2016. So the election in the US, of course, was, a huge shock, and I think this was kind of the first stage in on my path to this topic, was exactly this kind of shock. But then, on the other hand, there was also this strange moment where suddenly people were talking about class again, which before I had always experienced as a kind of taboo topic almost. Right? I don't know if this was maybe different in other disciplines, but I almost found it a bit liberating to be able to talk about the working class and so on, like all these things that were kind of put away for a while. But then there was the second stage, I would say, in this drama, which was a very intense discontent about the way that this discourse unfolded. And I'm sure I'm not alone in this. If you think of all the debates about the white working class, the kind of uneducated, illiberal brutes in the heartland, and how they brought us Trump and racism and so on, and this, of course, is not only a dishonest kind of discourse, but also one that is politically very fatal, because it effectively turns the far right into the representatives of working class grievances. So I think there's a time I encountered a lot of people who were doing exactly this kind of work that I thought was needed to bring in a more nuanced picture and more like varied kind of relational assessment of the situation, putting things in their right place and making sense of them. And actually also going and talking to people and trying to understand them in a way that was not just such a top-down kind of stereotypical way. So basically, the areas where I found this kind of work being done, and was very happy to see all the things that were happening, are basically the ones that are, assembled here, in personified by all of you, which I think, sort of to just briefly name check, is cleavage theory, which had been diagnosing these class realignments for a long time already before the public attention came to all of this, and really develops a sort of an encompassing theory of these dynamics. There were the anthropological studies of class and politics, of which, of course, Don Kalb is also a very important proponent, but actually, maybe at this stage to mention, I'm also really happy that Jaro Stakul made it to this conference, because he actually came up with the title of this conference, which was a paper from 2004? 2011, sorry, exactly, which we just ripped off basically because we thought it was such a good formulation of the problem. Anyway, so these anthropological studies of class, of course, the Bourdieusian studies, of which there are also very smart and interesting examples here at the conference, and then labor studies, of course, often inspired by Marxism, but not necessarily, that really looked into the type of political socialization affected by workplace organizations in transnational capitalism, and I think this sheds a lot of light also on the background of these phenomena. And lastly, that there was also a kind of revival of themes of class and political economy in social movement studies, which is done a lot here at Scuola Normale as well, and where you could tell that, there's really something happening there. So I'm really happy that actually from all of these areas that are kind of jointly, redirecting their attention to class, because all of these fields, of course, have a history of looking at class. We have people here at the conference, and I think basically the way we imagine this conference is coming together of these different tribes within the research complex, basically, and to try to talk to each other and to hopefully be able to give each other inspiring input. So just to explain, this is also reflected in the program, but actually I realized this is the old program. So I'll later put up a link where you can see the up-to-date one. But you probably understood, like there's a thematic kind of grouping not only within the panels, but also of the panels. So we have A1 and A2, for example, are both kind of concerned with electoral politics mainly. B1 and B2 are dealing mainly with social movements. C1 and C2 are essentially labor studies panels, and D1 and D2 are maybe what you'd call studies of milieus. So, but again, the idea is hopefully to not only stay within those kinds of confines, but also to have exchanges across these boundaries. So, while we were very lucky with your contributions and all the abstracts that we got, which actually surprised us a lot because we got so many abstracts, and we thought we would do a small kind of workshop type of conference, and actually we got so many things that we decided to extend it greatly and make it into a big thing. But so while in this area we were very lucky, we were unfortunately very unlucky when it came to the keynote, or at least 2 out of the 4, because now after the medical emergency that made Mike Savage cancel, there was another one, and both of them not serious, luckily, that incapacitated Klaus Dörre, so who can actually also not speak to us, which is, of course, very unfortunate. But he already wrote his speech because he actually just decided to drop out last night, so this was a very last-minute kind of thing. And the speech is very nice, and I will circulate it, and we'll just have to read it instead of hearing him hold it. But so this means that also there will be changes in the program. And today we will have much more time. We'll have a very comfortable kind of schedule in our discussions. So the way we're going to do this now is that we start with the 2 keynotes of Donatella and Don. And we do this in the way that first Donatella speaks, then we'll have a short discussion only about her presentation. And then Don will speak. Again, we will have a short conversation only about his talk, and then we'll go into a more general discussion of themes that they maybe have in common and general questions. And for this, actually, we have a lot of time. So basically, we can just keep talking, until we get bored and want to go to lunch. And then lunch today is, unfortunately, could not be provided by us. So, we'll just find, like there's loads of restaurants here in the area. I put one on the program, not because it's particularly good, but because it's very close. But like there's lots of other places that are very comparable, and you can just go wherever you want. And then later after we come back, there's the first panel. Then we'll have a book forum, which is also very nice, I think. And then we'll have a kind of evening snacks, which is here, which we have here at the department. And also tomorrow we'll have lunch all together. So this just, I think, as kind of organizational things. One thing about the panels, we were talking about this last night. We were thinking it could be a good idea to structure it in the way that there are 2 presentations, then a discussion, then again 2 presentations and the discussion, so that we have the dynamic where things kind of come together, but where it's not like that you hear 4 presentations and then people only remember the last one that they just heard. So this also for the chairs who maybe... Okay. Right, so yeah, I think, or maybe actually also at this point already, thanks a lot that we can do this here at Scuola Normale, that who gave us the money to do this, but also thanks a lot to the administrative and technical staff that were tireless in the preparation of this conference, so especially Federica Codegone, Alberta Bacchelli, and Francesco Giorgetti. They were very important. And I think with this, or did I forget something? No. Okay, with this I hand over to Donatella Del Porta, who will hold the first keynote. Donatella is the dean of our faculty here and has written way too many books for me to enumerate them. And but yeah, I mean, most of you will probably know her as an icon in the field of social movement studies, and this is also what she will be talking about today, connecting this with a legacy of class analysis in this field. So, thank you.
Thank you, Linus. Thank you all for the interest in this conference and for your participation. And thank you to Don for having accepted to participate in our opening sessions. Linus started by telling about his drama when thinking about his PhD. I've also lived this drama because I was his supervisor, and I still am, but also because coming from the perspective of social movement studies, in fact it was quite frustrating to see that in the past there had been very little debate on class structures that could be useful for understanding nowadays time. So in fact, especially starting with the global justice movements and then with the anti-austerity protests, there were some loud complaints by scholars in the field that's sort of self-critical in part, and in part criticizing the broader development of the fields, noted that class capitalism were all terms that social movement studies had basically forgotten. And that instead emerged as very relevant in order to understand nowadays politics and nowadays contentious politics. So I had to go back to my memories of the 70s when I was myself a student and when we had the first seminars on some authors that started to be discussed again quite with a lot of attention nowadays. I went back to my bookshelves, took down some of the books that had remained hidden up. And of course, this was an exercise that I also plan to do a bit today, but it was not sufficient in order to try to understand class classes nowadays. So in social movement studies, there have been some attempts to discuss classes and especially the agencies of the anti-systemic or counter movements, but we need still to do a lot of work in order to understand classes nowadays. So what I wanted to do today, since I just started to work on the issues of class and capitalism, is to respond to some of the frustrations that we had by going a bit back in the past, in another moment in which there was a very similar discussions about the classes without consciousness, the disappearances of the working class, the decline of mobilizations, and instead, quite suddenly, something maybe similar to what's happening now emerged, and scholars started to talk of a resurgence of class struggles. So, as Linus mentioned, the conference emerged from some prompts that came from interesting work in these fields, but also some frustrations about how the debate had emerged after the dramatic events that Linus mentioned, after Trump, after Brexit, after this year in which terms like backlash emerged in order to define what seemed to be big challenges to progressive politics. And the interpretation of these transformations was very often pointing at the white working class as the culprits, responsible for these changes. And in electoral politics, but also in social movement studies, there was some attention to the fact that statistically some right-wing parties appeared as more supported by lower classes than by upper classes. But my frustration with this type of interpretations was related with different definitional and analytic issues. One is that the conservative of the working class, I think, was to a large extent an exaggerated claims, because it was based on weak type of correlations and the lack of a deepening of the analysis on under which conditions some elements of conservatism and lack of consciousness can emerge. But also I think another part of my frustration came from the fact that classes in many analyses tended to overlap with the statistical definitions in social stratifications, so quintiles and where did you locate individually on on this type of scales. While even my memories of the 70s reminded me that the debate about classes was much more sophisticated, and that was much deeper, as I'm trying to say, going back to the debates about classes in the 70s. Also, I think what's this initial attention to the failure of the working class in supporting progressive politics was that it also tended to with exceptions, but it tended to forget about the meaning of class consciousness and the reflections on how consciousness emerges. And this is why in these presentations I want to take a Luxembourgian perspective, if I can say so, looking at how consciousness also in the past emerged during a moment of action. So consciousness emerged through and out of the mobilizations itself. So I think that this element of that we also put in the titles of the analysis of how consciousness emerges is particularly important nowadays in a moment in which we see that there is a lot of resistance to the backlashes of the 2016. There is the emergence of many types of protests in which social issues are certainly relevant, and if there is consciousness or not, these are issues that we have to look at by looking at the development of the protests themselves. So when we decided with Linus to organize this conference, I was very interested in the topic, but I had not yet planned to write these contributions that I also have in written forms and can be distributed if you are interested in. The prompt came from another initiative. Alessandro Pizzorno, who was an important Italian sociologist working at the European University Institute and with whom I had the luck to work, died last year, and there will be a conference in his honor, and I was asked to present his work on social movements, and for this specific purpose, I invested part of the summer in reading about this moment that he, together with other scholars like Colin Crouch or David Soskic, he had studied very in depth. And it was the moment of the early 70s in which after a lot of debates in the social sciences about end of ideologies, end of classes, decline of the labor, decline of the working class, there was suddenly a resurgence of protest, and in particular this group of scholars led by Alessandro Pizzorno worked on several European countries, looking at what in Italy came to be known under the name of the Hot Autumn of 1969. By chance maybe, but it is an interesting coincidence that we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of this 1969 Hot Autumn, and that's in fact, at least in the Italian comments on the events on this November, there has been a lot of citations of the Hot Autumn of 1969. So, Hot Autumn of 1969 I found as particularly revealing for our debate because it was a moment in which the social sciences were to a large extent unprepared to this resurgence of social issues, progressive politics, and big movements marching in the street. And also because this research that was done at that time pointed, I think, at several issues that are important nowadays in order to reflect on how class and consciousness relate and how they are related with collective actions and social movements, which is what we are also interested in. So I start with this citation by Rosa Luxemburg, written in 1906. And when she was writing about the mass strikes, the massive strikes in Russia. And it is an interesting reading, I think, also from the sociological point of view. She wrote, among other things, the mass strike is such a changeable phenomenon that it reflects all the phases of the political and economic struggle, all the stages and factors of the revolution. Its adaptability, its efficiency, the factors of its origins are constantly changing. It suddenly opens new and wide perspectives of the revolutions when it appears to have already arrived in a narrow pass. It flows now like a broad billow over the whole kingdom and now divides into a gigantic network of narrow streams. Now it bubbles forth from under the ground like a fresh spring, and now it's completely lost under the earth. So this dynamics, I think, is something that is relevant also nowadays. Also, she wrote political and economic strikes, mass strikes and partial strikes, demonstrative strikes and fighting strikes, general strikes of individual branches of industry, and general strikes of individual towns, peaceful wage struggles and street massacres, barricade fightings. All these run through one another, run side by side, cross one another, flow in and over one another. It is ceaselessly moving, changing sea of phenomenon. Strike actions itself does not cease for a single moment. It merely alters its forms, its dimensions, and its effect. And, well, I found these citations also particularly interesting in describing a moment in which we saw a lot of protest going on. The Italian newspaper daily Il Manifesto, a left-wing daily, has cited both 1968 and 1969, calling this moment this went inside, but autunno caldo, so the hot autumn of 1969. And the events we are referring to with the hot autumns of 2019 are the bubbling of protest, strikes, masses in the street that are going on globally all over the world in this November and prepared by various forms of demonstrations. Protest in Lebanon, protest in Chile, protest in Hong Kong, protest in Barcelona. They are all moments in which there is the re-emergence of a debate about how the crisis has produced not only a right-wing backlash, but also resistance. And there is also a lot of discussions about the role that the working class, the labor, specific characteristic of capitalism, exploitations, and so on, have as a common ground that is at the basis of all these mobilizations. So these are all protests that are eventful in the sense that they developed from a spark, very often from a minor type of grievance on the straw that broke the camel back, and that mobilized very quickly, suddenly, very large masses of people. The millions marches in Lebanon, in Chile, but also in other countries in the Middle East and in other countries in Latin America have these characteristics of bringing masses in the streets, using disruptive forms of actions, reacting to repressions with sort of civil disobedience, and calling for social justice, using national flag and referring to each other, often in solidarity, through the use of these common symbols. So I think this events also brings about some questions about how class emerges in actions, class consciousness, and what the class consciousness is, in which, how do we define, which was always a question that Alessandro Pizzorno used to ask. How do we define classes? How do we define consciousness? And what we can see in actions during these events. So, attempt to bring capitalism back into the analysis, I think, is something that is driving some research on this emerging phenomenon. And it is also pointing at the fact that not only in social movement studies, but also in other disciplines that had been quite attentive to issues of classes, classes have in the past disappeared as concepts that could have analytic weight. Beverly Silva talked about the ways in which social movement literature dismissed the concept of capitalism, but she also said economic sociology and labor sociology has done the same. Because while in the 70s scholars worked about the resurgence of class struggles, immediately thereafter there was a moving away from this type of attentions. In labor sociology, that started to consider unions mainly as actors of industrial relations or institutionalized forms of consultations, corporative agreements and the like. And in social movements that thought that the progressive actors were more new middle classes, or that social movements were anyhow no longer connected with specific classes. And what also disappeared a bit is the analysis of global capitalism in a moment in which, as Jeff Goodin observed, exactly in a moment in which global capitalism became even more powerful. And he wrote in 2013, in 2019, looking at the events that I've just cited, we can say not only it became more powerful, but it became also massively contested. So all these protests that I mentioned have different immediate triggers and develop in different type of social and political context, but they have in common a certain type of structural development in capitalism, and not only structural, also type of forms of development. So Alessandro Pizzorno would have asked, what is class? And I think that in many of the analyses there are some different focuses that to a certain extent could also be related with different ways in which Marxism has critical visions of capitalism has been developed in different approaches. So classes is still considered as a statistical aggregate. Social stratification studies have survived as one of the fields in which there was still attention to classes, even though it was mainly transformed into statistical aggregate. There is still reflection on class as organizations, so sort of more Leninist type of approach in which the basis of class consciousness is related to the type of organizations that act in this. There is a vision of class as consciousness, and I think that it is not by chance that since a few years Antonio Gramsci has been revisited a lot in thinking about the cultural hegemonic dimensions of capitalism. And there is what I cited before, Rosa Luxemburg type of approaches in which classes is more embedded into struggles, into actions, which are expressions of consciousness, but are also the spaces in which consciousness tend to develop. So, if there is, to a certain extent, a resurgence of class struggle, which type of concepts can we use? There are many concepts that are present in the literature that have been not so influential in mainstream social movement studies, but which are potentially useful to think about this new moment. One is Polanyi's concept of counter-movements, as movements that react to particular forms of capitalism, in which Polanyi was thinking about the first great transformations, moment in which social protection decline and attention to free market increases. There is the concept of anti-systemic movement, that is a concept that has been developed in social movement studies by the world system approach, pointing at the sort of almost automatic reactions of classes to exploitations and the moving of conflicts into the places in which capital moves, as Beverly Silver mentioned. There are also concepts that have been used in labor sociology, like resurgence of labor or social movement unionism, and I think also the concept of eventful social protest is helpful to understand our time. So, moving to what the analysis of the 60s and the 70s can tell us 50 years later in reflecting on a new autumn and the potential for the re-emergence of class consciousness, or what to look into when we think about class consciousness. I think something that the research by Alessandro Pizzorno pointed at is important for us as well, and it is that the emergence and low ebb of class actions and class struggles is a dynamic phenomenon that we have to follow in its type of developments. It is high time, he wrote, that attention be paid to periodic variations in certain phenomena. Otherwise, at every new upstart of a wave of conflict, we shall be induced to think that we are at the verge of a revolution, and when the downswing appears, we shall predict the end of class conflicts. And I think this is a citation of 1978, but would apply perfectly also to this moment. And so the fact that there have been in history moments of, I say, low ebb and moment of peaks of mobilization is something that is important, I think, to keep in mind also from the analytic point of view, because it pushes us to revisit the past histories in order to try to find insights not only from the events but also from the sociological analysis of the events itself. And one specific element that Alessandro Pizzorno has addressed when analyzing that specific moment of resurgence of class struggles is, I think, particularly relevant for the topic that we are going to discuss in this conference. And it is the conflicts on what he called recognition. So he distinguished because between struggles that emerge when class consciousness is clearly defined, structured within organizations, and these organizations define what the class interest is, and there is an acknowledgement of these classes as representing some types, mobilizing on some types of interest. But I think the most interesting insights for reflecting on this moment is when does it happen, like in the mass strike in Russia that Rosa Luxemburg was studied, new consciousness emerges. So what Pizzorno called struggles for recognitions. What happens when we move suddenly from a perception that the most important classes that made the history of contentious politics are declining, and new struggles emerges, mobilizing those that do not fit in the image of the previous type of structures, and which type of characteristics we have in this type of struggles. So the research on 1969 and the autumn of 50 years ago pointed at the fact that there were some characteristics of these struggles that emerged from those groups that were considered to be with low class consciousness, but that in their development brought about not only new forms of class consciousness, but also new forms of organizations and new forms of action repertoires, new forms of protest. So the suggestions coming from this research is that there are cycles, not only in terms of cycles of protest, but also in terms of cycles of emergence and re-emergence of classes, class struggles and class consciousness. And that when this emerges, struggles take different organizational forms and repertoires, and also surprise the observers because the struggles do not come from usual suspects, but come from groups that were considered to be as the most difficult to mobilize. And I want to make some points based on reflections of 50 years ago, on an approach which I think helps to think about classes going beyond the structural and statistical definitions, and reflecting on how in actions the type of organizational forms, repertoires of actions, and consciousness is transformed. So, writing about the French moment of the that we can call autumns or the 68 movements in France, Dubras wrote that radical forms of actions, like the one that developed in that period, occurred more frequently among workers without any long-standing social adaptation to industry, unskilled workers, young workers, migrants, and we can add women, or once again among workers that have no traditions of unionizations. These new workers have been undertaking actions for the first time. So there is in this research a lot of attention to the fact that for many social groups, social strata, the type of balance between incentives and disincentives towards mobilizations is an unsettled balance that is changed by, I would say, a relational moment in which the different social groups comes together. So if we think about back in the 60s, there were many social groups that had potentials to mobilize, but also potential not to mobilize, that had potentials to mobilize on class consciousness and potential to mobilize on corporatist type of interest. This was true for what was called the new middle class, the highly technological type of labor forces, but this was true also for the unskilled labor that was considered in this research as one of the driving force of the protest. So I think that what happened then that is relevant to analyze for thinking about nowadays is the fact that protests did not emerge from the high-skilled working class that was supposed to be the one with high level of consciousness and high level of tradition in the unionizations, but it emerged at the margins, and it emerged, Alessandro Pizzorno would say, from struggles for recognitions from groups that had no traditions of labor struggles, which didn't mean no tradition of struggle at all, but that they were coming with a different form of repertoires and different types of claims. I think that what this brought about, and could be relevant to reflect upon when we think about nowadays, is the big transformations in the organizational structures. So these struggles for recognitions of the 70s were struggles that challenged the existing trade unions. In Italy, also the existing trade unions on the left, that developed a form or organizational form that were more apt to represent some types of struggles than others. And it was from the needs of the struggles, from the needs of the organization, that this new format emerged. Alessandro Pizzorno was particularly interested in the relationship between parties and unions as representative and their relations with their rank and file. And what a lot of this research pointed at is that the existing organizations tend to represent structured type of interest, but emerge as unable to represent new groups that are emerging. And so the struggles of new groups also requires transformations in the organizational forms. This research pointed at one element which is important, is these struggles were not spontaneous, but to the opposite, required a very deep-rooted type of organizational forms, the so-called delegate, the workers' autonomous representatives, that had to exercise a broad and wide type of control through legitimations in order to develop forms of actions that were similar to the one that Rosa Luxemburg had described, in the sense that they were innovative forms that were based on transformations of the balance of costs of the traditional strikes in order to increase the leverage, the capacity of the workers to have an effect in the struggles. So in this moment, I think we have to expect transformations in the organizational forms so that you can find a challenge to the existing organizational forms of the class, of the labor, of the movements, with other type of organizational structures. In that case, it was very horizontal forms of representations, rooted within the working place. Elections of delegates directly from the workers with high level of controls. Another element which is, I think, relevant to reflect upon and developed from the research that I cited on the 60s and the 70s refers to the repertoire of actions. So when interests are well established and recognized, some forms of actions develop that tend to become resilient, to become path dependency, to be used historically in a consistent way in different waves of actions. When struggles for recognitions emerge, so new social groups emerge and struggle to be recognized, but also in a logic of becoming, we can say, in defining themselves. What happens is also that there is an innovation in the repertoires. In the 60s, it was especially a form of articulations of strikes over time. It was a very capillary type of organizations. It was strikes of short time, articulated in different places so that the damage was higher for the owners and lower for the workers, but especially it required, but at the same time produced a strong cohesion among the workers, because it needed widespread approval and a capillary network which could rapidly transmit the orders of the plant union leaders. So it required broad support, and it was innovative. So it was not the traditional forms of struggles, but historians have started to look at the 60s also to point at the re-emergence of forms of disruptive actions that had developed in the past, that scholars lecture still is considered as belonging to the pre-capitalist repertoires of actions. And finally, what emerges from this research is that during these struggles that didn't last forever, but lasted for some years until the mid-70s, one of the outcome was long-lasting. So the cycle of protest declined. After the peak, there was a low ebb. There was an economic crisis. There was an attempt by the existing trade unions to use the strength they had acquired to negotiate and defend some rights during the crisis. But this research pointed the fact that some elements remain, and among these main elements is a sort of empowerment, a sort of memory of this type of struggles, and organizational structures remain transformed, so don't go back to the previous stage, but adapt to a new stage. Forms of actions remain parts of the new repertoires, and especially there is a sort of recognitions of some specific groups, which is also expressed in some specific claims. So, for instance, among the developments of the 70s, not only in Italy, but also in Germany, in France, and in other countries, was the fact fact that some more egalitarian claims were put forward that were not in the traditions of the working labor claims before this moment. There were claims about conditions of working, conditions of living that were not negotiated through salary increase, but that also looked at those specific type of forms. And there were claims about democracies within the factories and how the type of representation of the worker to develop. So there was some legacy, and there was especially a transformations then from a struggle for recognitions in a struggle of already recognized interest that I think is relevant to follow as a process. So I started with Rosa Luxemburg, and I would like to finish the presentation also with citations from her. Not yet. In fact, this is a citation from Alessandro Pizzorno before, in which he says the process of formations of new collective identities and of a dispersions of power may thus be seen as responsible for the destabilizations of a system of industrial relations and for the increase in claims and conflict. But they tend also to generate processes in the opposite directions, that is, to have restabilizing effect. And so what he basically pointed is that there is an emergence of new type of classes. So now I go to summarizing and returning to Rosa Luxemburg. What seems to be the suggestions from this type of research is the need to bring class back in, but not just as statistical aggregates, but looking at the ways in which struggles, actions, mobilizations creates the conditions for the emergence of consciousness and create these conditions in practice from the practical needs of the struggle, from the need of organizing, from an encounters between ideas that are developed by intellectuals and needs of the struggles. So the class consciousness, in these cases, emerges in actions and through specific form of actions in what Alessandro Pizzorno has conceptualized as struggles for recognitions. Through the development of innovative repertoires that require other forms of organizations, and through the development of reflections and ideas about this. And back to Rosa Luxemburg and this essay on the Russian mass strike, in which she also discusses in a polemical way the positions of the German trade unions. What she points at, and I think is relevant also for the analysis that I have presented, is the fact that struggles are not spontaneous or disorganized, but are spaces in which new organizational forms and consciousness of the group emerges. So what she wrote, and I think it's relevant nowadays as well, is the most precious lasting thing in the rapid ebb and flow of the wave is its mental sediment, the intellectual, cultural growth of the proletariat, which proceeds by fits and starts and which offers an inviolable guarantee of their further irresistible progress in the economic as in the political struggle. The circumstances, the conditions of capitalist development and of the bourgeois state make it impossible that in the normal course of things, without stormy class struggles, certain sections can be organized at all. So the relevance of the actions is, I think, something that emerges from 1906 and as from 1969, and is relevant also nowadays. So this, I think, a way to reflect on how class consciousness can emerge in action, and I give the floor back to Linus. Thank you very much.
Right, so as I said, we will now have a round of questions directly about Donatella's presentation, maybe for 10 minutes or so, just if there's like direct, or also reactions, comments. And then afterwards, we'll continue with Don and have a general discussion at the end after both of them. But are there direct reactions to this keynote?
University, Finland. Hear me, or do you, I need mic? Oh, mic.
Yes, it's better because we are in streaming.
Yeah. Thank you for very inspiring presentation. I will first have a small comment and then a question. The first comment is dealing with this cyclical development of protests and social actions, and you were looking at Pissarro and his analysis concerning the 70s. And that was at the end of one cycle. If we can somehow put it into frames, the cycle started at the end of the Second World War, and then 1960s and the student movements at the end of 1960s, and then industrial workers were striking all over Europe during the end of 60s and then in the 70s. And then the revolution was over. Then came Thatcher, and then came Reagan, and completely different kind of political wave. And now we are in a different kind of protest cycle. You were quoting to mass protest in Lebanon, Hong Kong, Barcelona in Chile, and those protests are completely different. Lebanon, people are rebelling against corruption. Hong Kong is question of independence or China's rule. Barcelona is about nation building and independence. Chile is a class movement. In Chile, working class is really angry because the country has been growing in economic terms, but then the results of the growth are really unequally distributed. But if we look at the current world and contemporary Europe and European protest movements, Italy has been kind of vanguard of wild strikes, but where are strikes in Italy now? Who are striking in Italy? In Finland, we have an interesting situation. We have the National Post company is on strike at the moment, and it's the first real industrial strike for years in Finland. And everybody is really looking with their eyes wide open that what's really happening. Why are they on strike? And they are on strike because of the company is going to lower the wages of the workers, and it's the state-run company. And there is a very wide acceptance of the industrial strike, really wide across the class borders. But where are the striking and fighting working class today? This is my general question, but then the real question for you is that when we talk about consciousness and class consciousness, we all know Marx quoted Klass an sich und Klass für sich, and that's the consciousness. But what do we understand by consciousness in contemporary world? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Guglielmo Meardi. I teach economic sociology here at the Scuola Normale. Thank you, Donatella, for getting back to the big questions and the important concepts, especially by Pizzorno. I wanted to stress a couple of differences, though, especially with Rosa Luxemburg's time, but maybe also with Pizzorno's time. Because if Rosa Luxemburg said that it was important to build consciousness through fighting, in particular through mass strikes, and give a political dimension to that, all these three operates much less now, in the sense that we now know, Rosa Luxemburg believed that even when the strikes don't work out, it's a good experience, it's a good training, next time it will work out. And now we know that when a defeat occurs, actually it may have a negative effect. The strike at Fiat in 1980 was a defeat. It took 10 years' time for Fiat workers to get the courage to go on strike again. And the 1984 strike of miners in the UK had the same effect. Also, we know that it is possible to organize workers without struggling. The best organized sector, private sector in Germany is the chemical sector, which is the sector where trade unions have never organized a strike. They do some warning strikes just as military drills, just to show that they are able to do it, but not the real thing. So it's possible to just symbolically organize strike. And in terms of mass strikes, what we see, in a way, it was already the comment before, strike still occurs, also in Italy. In terms of numbers, actually there's still many strikes, but the size is becoming tiny. In terms of volume of working hours lost in strikes, this has collapsed since the 70s, and the trend, there is no indication that the trend can be reversed, because it's smaller groups that go on strike, and they used to go for a strike for months, for weeks. Now they learn it is possible. If you are tactically able, you can go on strike for a few hours every now and then, so the impact is much less. And the third point about politics, that was very specific to Russia, where the state was directly involved in the management of capitalism in a way that no other capitalist country has ever occurred, by forcing people to go to work legally. And that doesn't occur anymore, because the state has learned, in democratic countries in particular, not to get involved too much. But even in an authoritarian one, the Chinese government has learned the experience of Russia and of the Soviet Union, and is very, very good at splitting. Although strikes occur in China, there is a labor movement of a kind, nothing of what Rosa Luxemburg expected is happening, because it's very, very fragmented. The state intervenes with carrots and stick in a way that has prevented any emergence of class consciousness. So these are three big differences. Therefore, the big questions remain, but empirically the trends are a bit different. And with Pizzorno, I think most concepts are still valid, especially expressive conflict, representation, and so on. But I wonder whether maybe, to go back to Linus' introduction, we are in an opposite situation in comparison to 69. So he was saying that expression was becoming more important than representation. What I see myself studying trade unions in Europe is that it's the opposite. That there are millions of trade union members. They want representation. They want a union to negotiate wage increases and good benefits. They don't want the union to get involved in politics and to express anything, because they want to vote for the far right or for anything else, which is exactly the problem of a section of the labor movement supporting Trump, or millions of people in Italy, millions of union members voting for the Northern League in Italy, which is what Pizzorno didn't expect probably in the 70s.
Didn't wish for sure.
Microphone. Someone gave me the microphone.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Peter Funke, University of South Florida, for a great presentation. I wanted to comment on the first point of that. I think, as you pointed out, and as was mentioned, like Hong Kong, for instance, are also related to capitalism. It's mostly the young that are rebelling against high prices and no labor kind of possibilities later. So I think, and the same is true, I think if you look at the Arab Spring in Cairo, it was not only about democracy, it was also about neoliberalism being brought in and thus sort of destroying. Syria is a similar example. So I think it's great sort of to see that. I wanted to ask you, or add maybe to your notion of class. And one of the things that was not maybe in this talk talked about more is class as a relational concept, meaning sort of towards the type of capitalism that we see, as well as towards the, let's call it the bourgeoisie, and how they fight back. And so one of the things that I would love to hear a little more is also on in the way that labor unions, elites of labor parties have been co-opted, is part of how we need to understand maybe the notion of class and the decomposition and possible recomposition of class as we see it unfolding today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Seraphim Seferiades from Pantheon-University of Athens. This was a very nice presentation, opening a very large array of questions. It's a huge area. And I think one element we must underline is what you mentioned about the fact that, to a large extent, talking about class and class consciousness is not a sociological issue, it's also a political issue and a subjective issue. It represents a trend away from objectivism into a more subjective understanding of all these processes. Now, the key thing is that reality is always mediated by diagnostic and prognostic frames which are applied by the identifying collectivity, to use that notion, political actors, in other words. So I'm very sympathetic to what you mentioned about the importance of repertoire renewal and the organizational issue. But shouldn't we also try to place these two concerns under this umbrella of the larger political narrative which is being presented to all the workers and laboring strata and other elements in society which can come together into forming an alternative perception of reality and of themselves in this reality. So in Rosa Luxemburg's sense, shouldn't we also include in this research agenda, which is a very large research agenda, sort of an effort to map out existing ontological narratives and perceptions of alternative realities and democratic futures and how problems must be tackled? And I'm sure that that answers to a large extent what the previous question pointed out about the small size of strikes and the fact that people want an organization, but to the extent that they don't see a political alternative, are not prepared to sort of do anything else. So in other words, everything is important, but a prerequisite is to have a robust political alternative which sort of brings everything together. Otherwise, it is possible to sort of drift to the far right or, express resistance to systemic situations in a way that makes little sense. And this is also required to address, Pizzorno's magnificent depiction of bureaucratization, this gap between expressive and, organized elements of political behavior. So I'd like to know whether you would consider that aspect part of the research agenda, to map out and organize existing answers to capitalist crisis.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very inspiring presentation. I'm Gábor Schering. I'm originally from Hungary, but I work here at Bocconi University. And my question is related to the place that I'm coming from, Central Eastern Europe. You mostly mentioned movements that are more or less progressive looking at the moment, like the one in Chile, but you also mentioned Trump. And I think this is a very crucial topic that I'd be really interested in hearing more from you about this. The phenomena of class conflict being expressed in less progressive forms, or whether we can conceptualize the rightward or nationalist or neo-nationalist drift of workers as an expression of class conflicts, or is this something completely different? In Central and Eastern Europe, this is a big issue, but I would say it's a big issue in other parts of Western Europe and the US definitely as well. But maybe it's the strongest in its current form in Poland or in Hungary, where if you have an expression of working class anger, it very often takes the form of some kind of either complete complete silence or withdrawal from politics or some form of nationalism. I'm not saying always, but very often. Now, would you consider this as a form of class consciousness, or is this a consciousness without class, or are these class conflicts at all? So this is my more specific question to you about the forms of class consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Teresa Pullano, University of Basel, Switzerland. Thank you for this really magistral presentation. I very much like the accent on the dynamic nature of class and also on its fragmented nature. My question concerns this concept of class struggle. It's not a theoretical or a definitional question. It's, of course, a substantial one. It seemed to me that in your presentation there was a questioning or a hesitation in between Luxembourg and Pizzorno, for example, because the concept of struggle for recognition to me seems pointing towards the idea that there can be then this recognition, it can be achieved. Whereas Luxembourg, especially the last quote that you showed us, talks about this stormy nature of the struggle, and to me it gives the idea that there is no composition possible. It's not, of course, something that can be answered once and for all. I'm asking you more where your intuition goes. And for that I will just quote briefly Etienne Balibar because it clarifies my point. In Race, Nation, Class, in his chapter on class, Balibar says that what binds social groups and individuals together is not a higher common good or a state or the law, rather it is perpetually evolving conflict. So my question is your feeling more towards the term of class struggle, or shall we talk about class conflict? And conflict for me speaks more about power differentials and the fact that this cannot be solved once and for all in a harmony. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Giorgos Bithimitris from National Center for Social Research, Greece. And I think it's Nancy Fraser that says the formulation, no recognition without redistribution. And it was quite surprising for me not to hear the word redistribution after this analysis about class and class consciousness today. I think that it's a crucial issue not only because of the accumulated wealth that we all know that is very different than 100 years ago, but because the concept of class, as you also suggested, is relational. So is it something that lacks? Is it something that we should also discuss, the redistribution?
I give a first round of answer, and also I will keep some of the answer for the last part of the discussion after Don's presentations, which I think would fill some of the gap of my own. For the moment, what I wanted to point at is the fact that, of course, I've used nowadays movements as suggested active illustrations. The research on the autumn of 1969 came out 10 years later. And so there are many things that we need to study on this wave and the way in which this wave will evolve, among which it's dynamic, so its capacity to transform itself during this intense moment, because it is true, and this part also what I wanted to point at, the fact that this type of movements that I referred to in the beginning at different specific starting points, specific triggers. That's for instance, also in the Lebanon case, however, had to do also with economic issues and with long times of austerities. There were movements that developed out of some memory of recent waves, including the anti-austerity protest, which were moments in which the mass strike, or at least the general strikes, has re-emerged, so especially in some countries. So to see in how far this sort of common reference to some structural conditions, the illiberal forms of the illiberal consequences of capitalism, about which Don has written and we talk about, and the exploitations of neoliberal forms. I think this is a common background. And then we have to see how the different forms of conflicts will develop in time. What we see nowadays is that already there is a reference to each other. And I think that this is also related with a specific moment of intensifications of time, a moment in which there is a perception that things can be changed, and in which movements are looking at each other in search for inspirations, but also in search for learning about what works and what doesn't. So not all the movements that emerge now will probably achieve their claims, but some examples are taken as indications that in this type of intense moment, Gramscian crisis, and so on, it is a moment in which agencies, empowerment, and so on can produce big and unexpected changes. So one common characteristics to these movements is that they are very quickly escalating their claims towards claims that address the very legitimacy of the political and social regimes. And this is the story in Chile, but it's also the story in Lebanon, with first claims that are even met immediately by the regimes, but when they are met is too little too late, and is the claim for constitutional changes that tend to dominate all this type of fight. So I think that it is an open question to see how let's say the equivalent of the economic claims that Rosa Luxemburg was talking about will become politicized. And so it is also an open question to which extent this is an eventful moment, and to which extent it is still sort of illusionary moment. But what is interesting is also that in our perceptions, and I'm thinking about Seraphine's observations, these are intense times in which also our own perceptions of what is happening is changing very quickly. So we had 2011, the revolutions, 2013, the expansion of the revolutions outside of specific areas with Gezi and the Brazilian movements. Then 2016, the impressions that it was the backlash, that no success, no progress politics was still active, and that it was the big transformations on the right, and that the working class were acting on the right. So I think this was the moment, and then nowadays we have visibility of the resistance. Also want to mention, I focus on these specific movements, but there have been also other mobilizations worldwide in the last month. The Fridays for Future and the Extinction Rebellions on the environment, and the protest of Ni Una Menos on violence against women are other examples of movements that starts with some focus on specific issues, but then to address them within a broader criticism of capitalism. So I think that it is this element of struggles creating arenas in which people change their position, consciousness emerges, and intense interactions develop. That is also something that is related with the specific historical time. So there have been reflections in history and in the social science about the ways in which also nationalism is transformed, and other forms of identifications are developed in different way in normal time. For instance, Bessinger studied this in normal times in which there is a stabilization of what exists, and instead in intense time, in transformative times in which new ideas emerge very quickly. What I also want to point at, but I'm sure that is an issue on which Don can address much better than me, is also the fact that when addressing the questions of what is consciousness and how it is expressed, that the reference to the past also tells us that consciousness is not such a clear-cut thing. That also when we look at this moment in which apparently class consciousness emerged, it didn't emerge in the ideal typical forms, but it was still a mix of economic and political claims, of more reflected upon and more instinctive type of claims, smaller and bigger interactions of different actors, including the interactions, thinking about Guglielmo's interventions between the existing unions and the struggles outside. So that's with all the potential tensions and actual tensions that they are, but also the fact that, as in the citations by Pizzorno was mentioned, there is then an effect also on unions, because unions perceive that the lack of struggles is something that in the long term has some specific consequences that could weaken even the strongest union. So also, it's a pity that Klaus Dörre cannot be with us, because he studied also these transformations in Germany, which was the case in which the analysis pointed at the capacity of the unions to use their structural strength, but also the failure in doing this. So also about the questions of conflicts, I would not expect a clear-cut developments in which then you have sort of end of conflicts, also because from social movement studies what we know is that there is no movement that achieved all what it wanted, and so that usually the results is a compromise. That my expectations would be that the results in this moment would be some more social democracy or not a political response that would equate a revolution. But I think that it is the lessons that is interesting then and now is that it is especially in this moment that consciousness emerges, in the sense of empowerment, in the sense of the feeling in hybrid forms. For instance, the fact that national flags are used is something that I'm sure Don will also address, that, but it's something that also in the past was, can I say, interacting a lot with other symbols and with the definitions of a class. So also about what's happening in Eastern Europe, I think that it is something that we have to look at waiting to see how some forms of resistance will develop also in those countries. What we have observed in the research that have been carried out in Cosmos, in the Center on Social Movement Studies, is that in some countries in Eastern Europe, notwithstanding the difficulties of using old ideological categories, there have been developments of struggles for social justice and so on. That there has been resistance in countries like Poland with the strong women's movement, that in your country, the example of Budapest could be interesting to look at, to see how even under illiberal circumstances, some political progressive proposals can win. But I can address also some of the other questions in the debate, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think with this we move on to Don Kalb, right? Don Kalb is a professor of social anthropology at the University of Bergen in Norway, and also an adjunct professor, I think, at the University of Utrecht. And he has edited or co-edited a collection called Headlines of Nation, Subtexts of Class, that if you haven't looked at yet, you should absolutely look at, because it's brilliant. And I think the introduction to this volume was the best I've read about the current conjuncture, and it was written even a bit ahead of this conjuncture in 2011, but it basically defines the whole field, and I was very impressed when I read it. And so this is one of the things he has done. There's also another book called Expanding Class, and at the moment I think you're also working on a project about anthropology of class. I'm sure you will tell us about it. Thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Linus. Thank you, Donatella. It's just fantastic to be here. Yeah, I mean, this is another moment where we can experience the fact that we are having a good crisis. I mean, us on the left in the social sciences, us Marxists, us anarchists, I don't know what, but we're having a good crisis, and we're talking substantial, radical, subaltern things again. It's fantastic that you bring us here. I know only very few people here, so this is also for me an exciting moment to sort of be recognized as an anthropologist of class among sociologists of social movements and labor. I loved going back to Rosa Luxemburg. That is, I think, a fantastic move that you're doing there. Emergences, time, the speeding up of time. I want to talk a little bit, well, let me talk a little bit about anthropology, because you know, it's an oxymoron that there should be an anthropology of class. So it would probably be interesting for you to hear a little bit about that. Then I will talk about space and time, and in particular time. Then I will talk about different ways of talking class. And then I will talk again a little bit about Eastern Europe, not because I think that Eastern Europe is so magnificently important. It's because I've been working there for a long while in the last 20 years. I also worked on the Netherlands before and on other Western locations, so I'm not necessarily a regional specialist on Eastern Europe. But Eastern Europe is so fascinating because it is the avant-garde case. It's the avant-garde case because of the total collapse of institutions, well, more than anywhere else, in 1989, 1995, and because all the trends that we experience in the West have emerged in Eastern Europe in magnified form. So for me, Eastern Europe is a conversation with tendencies that are basically happening everywhere. Well, then first a little bit about the oxymoron of the anthropology of class. Anthropology has never really dealt with industrial working classes, let alone with the Fordist working class. There's only perhaps 4 or 5 monographs in the whole of 20th century and early 21st century anthropology that deal with such classes. That's probably been an advantage in our embrace of class and labor. So at this particular moment in time, there is a Marxian anthropological commission in the International Union of Ethnological and Anthropological Sciences. There is a strong anthropology of labor network at the European Association of Social Anthropologists. There's a strong APES, Anthropological Political Economy network at Casca, is Canada, and there's an emergent socialist network of anthropologists within the AAA, the American Anthropological Association. All of this sort of embodies, well, an effort of a whole set of people who knew each other for a long while, and I've been one of the actors in there over time in bringing together people, PhDs, MAs, junior scholars, and sort of getting a focus again on issues of class and labor. Why could it happen in anthropology, and why would it happen in anthropology in a sort of creative, open, experimental way? One of the reasons is that we never really dealt with the Fordist working class. And so for us, class and labor was always a deeply heterogeneous thing. Most of us were working in the global south, not even the US or Europe. Social reproduction, the articulation of class with kinship, class and region, class with race, questions of intersectionality were there all the time and all over the place. So this forced us to develop a language of class that was in many ways more nimble, more situated, more experiential, and in my own terms, in particular, deeply relational. Now, one of the reasons I think why anthropology could be a site for the opening up towards new creative work on class and labor was that our conflict around the cultural turn played itself out a little bit earlier than in the other social sciences. So Clifford Geertz, in the mid-1970s, was probably the proponent within anthropology of the cultural turn. And so the cultural turn in anthropology did not happen in the midst of the rise of neoliberalism, like it did in history, or in sociology, or in political science. It happened before. And so it happened at a moment that Marxism, articulation of modes of production, Godelier, Meillassoux, Eric Wolf, in particular in the US, were very, very strong authors and allowed many people to sort of start the fight back against the cultural turn at a moment that the chances were still good, so to speak. So when I started to work in anthropology in the late 1970s, that fight had already been sort of waged. The positions were clear. It was also clear for us on the left in anthropology that the cultural turn was not something like a fascinating liberation. It was conservative, and we didn't want it. And so from that moment on, even though, of course, the cultural turn became also very hegemonic in anthropology, like everywhere else, certainly in the course of the 90s and early 2000s, there was nevertheless a very strong, ingrained resistance to it. The work of Eric Wolf and students of Eric Wolf, you remember Eric Wolf, the Marxist anthropologist, Europe and the People Without History, important book, was very important in that. And so around the students of Eric Wolf in the US emerged the connections with Europe, with me and with others. And those were the nucleus around which then at some point a new anthropology of class and labor began to be built. Then again, anthropology, being so non-national, being so cosmopolitan, and at the same time being driven by fieldwork and ethnography, was of course very well situated intellectually, methodologically, to deal with the fact of globalization, right? So, well, for sociology and history in a way, political science in a way, globalization was a problem because, you know, you had such an ingrained methodological nationalism, and you still have in those sciences, including an ingrained focus on the West, that you could actually miss that there was not something going on like the adieu au proletariat, right? Because for anthropology it was always very clear that massive working classes were being created in the global South, and then of course in China. So the idea that there was something like the end of work or the end of the working class, from an anthropological perspective, that was always complete nonsense, right? We were there at the moment all the time in the last 30 years when the global proletariat was being tripled, right? From about 500 million to about 1.5 billion, and it's going on, right? It will be 2.5 billion in about 10 years from now. So all these very methodologically nationalist, Western-focused, nation-state-focused studies of Fordist working classes and their labor unions that got on the defensive and were crumbling down, all of that did not really affect the anthropology of class and labor. And our class was a much more multi-scalar, much more stretched out, spatially dense, spatially networked, following the value chain sort of notion. And anything could be class, because class for us very quickly got sort of reduced to the very basic relations of exploitation and of extraction, not to a particular form of work organization. So that is, I think, those were the moments, the intellectual and situational moments that allowed the anthropology of class and labor to emerge in a creative way, while basically everywhere else class and labor were, well, being silenced in politics and sort of being marginalized in academia. Now let me talk a little bit about space and time, because I think this is an incredibly important topic that we might not even be fully open enough to at the moment yet. That is why it's also so interesting to go back to Rosa Luxemburg. I've been reading Trotsky, I've been reading Gramsci in the last years, and I must say all of this is simply extremely liberating intellectually to get that back. But before I move into space and time, I want to just make one very simple statement, which is about class and consciousness. There's only one class in the last 150 years that has had real class consciousness. And we all know that. That is the capitalist class. And what does the capitalist class do? The capitalist class struggles. So class struggle is something that, I had a debate with Erik Olin Wright. And Erik was already, this is the early 2000s, and we had it actually from Turkey. And Erik was already moving from Marx to Weber. And, I thought he wasn't very radical at all, in fact. There was no idea in Erik that class consciousness was concentrated among the capitalist class. He was searching for it among the industrial proletariat. And he was finding some traces, but not very much of it. But class consciousness and class struggle is what capitalism does, what capitalism is. So what we have been discovering also, next to class and labor, over the last years, and in particular, of course, since 2008, is the simple fact of capitalism. We have been rediscovering capitalism. There is no talking class, there's no talking labor, there's no talking exploitation and all of this without actually discovering capitalism. Now, for social scientists, this is a difficult thing to do, and for economists also, right? But now we're moving to space and time. This is the next chapter. But we have been discovering this, right? And so, since 2008, we have had a good crisis. There's a lot of things we have learned. It's not just David Graeber with his 100,000 copies of Debt. It's not just Piketty with his 1,000,000 copies, plus the Financial Times Book of the Year award. Just imagine. This, it's paid by McKinsey. Piketty on class and capital. Was very little class for very little capital debt, but nevertheless, he was talking about it. It's not just now Branko Milanovic, right? There's this massive proliferation of new left-wing Marxian and non-Marxian, I would say a very broad theoretical horizon. Marxism inevitably, may I remind you of the fact that David Harvey is a distinguished professor of anthropology. Yeah, we all laugh about it. He himself laughs and he's annoyed about it too. But we have a very intelligent conversation going, transdisciplinary, about capitalism, exploitation, extraction, the inevitable end of growth that is unimaginable within capitalism, all the intersections, if you want to call them intersections, I think they are at the heart of it, gender, environment, etc., since 2009. The debate is very much open, I would say. Marx is the core, but there is Mauss, there is Trotsky, there is Polanyi, there's Weber, there's Gramsci. In many ways, I think, we are going back to the pre-war set of radical intellectuals that help us really sort of refine the set of concepts and methodologies that allow us to penetrate what is going on with this big thing, capitalism, around us. Now, space and time. And don't worry, I will go micro at some point too. But space and time. We are celebrating, at this particular moment, 70 years of the Chinese People's Republic, 30 years of the fall of the wall. Those are, of course, massive moments, historical, intellectual, political moments. The rise of illiberalism in the West, everywhere differently. I'm deeply Trotskyian in the sense that whatever I say is about combined and uneven, right? So don't look for essences in anything here. But the tendencies are there everywhere. It is very likely that liberal capitalism will lose. It has a lot of consequences for class, for consciousness, for the forms of exploitation, extraction, expropriation, and for the politics that we can imagine. It's very interesting if you follow the liberal press over the, let us say, from 2008 to now. Of course, 2008 there was the shock about the financial crisis. They couldn't believe it. So it was a moral problem. It was about greed and all of that, and some people had to be punished. Even the Financial Times still wants some bankers to be punished and so on. But that was basically it at that point in time. 2011, finally, the risings were happening. A failed moment as we know, retrospectively. The set of mischances. We were not prepared. Nobody was prepared. Nobody was prepared for the financial crisis. Nobody was prepared for the risings of 2011 and around 2011. But liberalism has been learning a lot. Liberalism is threatened. If you read The Economist or the Financial Times or the New York Times, whatever, then you actually see that with the new wave of risings that is happening at this very moment, we were talking Lebanon, we were talking Chile, we didn't talk North Africa, we didn't talk Sudan. 2011 is back in many ways, and we don't know where it goes. Gilets jaunes, we didn't talk to Gilets jaunes. Very important movement, if you ask me. Also from a sort of relational class perspective, and all the hybridities that emerged within that. 2011 is back, and it will be back, and it will be back, and it will be back. It will only increase. There's no doubt about that. The liberal press is now at the point that they actually admit that this is not all about the internet and people connecting so fast via the social media. There is something substantial going on. The liberal press has learned, and of course they've only learned because they are themselves threatened. And, you know, the white working class, I'm sorry about this, I hate the concept, we all hate the concept, but the white working class is for them, of course, the symbol of what is happening. There are new claims for redistribution, there are mobilizations, there's anger about social inequality, there's a keen sense in all these mobilizations, on the right and on the left. I will come back to Eastern Europe, and I will actually argue that the drive towards the liberal right in Eastern Europe has been about mobilizations, about anger and mobilizations. Dispossessions. People know that there are dispossessions going on, disenfranchisements. So rather than looking at and trying to find, and this is again about time, the sort of working class consciousness or strike consciousness of the 1970s, when all the risings were basically risings within and against the high point of the national welfare state. The risings in the contemporary conjuncture are deeply different. They are about globalized capital. They are about the class war that capital within its globalizing moment has been waging, well, to the 99%. Or if you believe Mike Savage, the 94%. Who cares about that? Right? So these are the sets of processes that are taking place. We now have the American Business Roundtable subscribing to the employee, environmental, and social goals of the UN. We have Gillian Tett, an anthropologist, in the Financial Times having her recurrent rubric on moral money. The Business Roundtable wants workers at the heart of company priorities. Liberalism is deeply shaken, and the capitalist class knows that has gone too far. They know, and they're thinking about it. But in the present context, there is very little chance, as Marx would know, that while they might think about it, they're not going to do it. Because there's China, there's an immense speed up of competition, there's a deep technological competition going on that can shake the heart of Western capitalism, and they know that China and Tencent and financial, etc., will have all the data of 1.5 billion people they want, and there won't be any protection of that. And as David Harvey is going to tell you in the next year with a paper that I've read, first version of, in the end, in capitalism, it's not all about competitiveness, etc. And even Marx was deeply aware that it is very much about the mass of capital. That's the paper that David is writing, the concept of mass in Marx. Nobody ever wrote about that. But it is basically everywhere in Marx. Marx is very deeply aware of it, and this is of course the issue. the mass of capital that might be controlled on a new, potentially illiberal, probably non-hegemon, is enormous. So these are the things that are going on. There is no chance that history will freeze again in the way we thought in the 1980s and 90s it had frozen into an end of history sort of thing, right? There's just no chance of that. What has class got to do with this? Well, I was talking about the capitalist class. I was talking about liberalism as the historical political imagination of the capitalist class. I was talking about the worldwide mobilizations. Class, in all of this, does not reappear in the form we have been trained to find it in the 20th century. Even though Fordist working classes are larger and perhaps even more key in many ways to capital now than 30 years ago. But they are transnational, they're globalized, they're fragmented, they're exploited, they're repressed. In the West and in the East and in the South. Class, I would say, and this is probably this is my own agenda, I think. And how would I say it? Yeah. So, class really is the absent presence and the present absence of the contemporary conjuncture. These are slightly Gramscian formulations, and I think we need them, absent presence and present absence. It sort of captures the idea that we are not going to find it in the ways that are transparent for us, like 30 or 40 years ago. But we will need to find it anyhow, in its fragmentations, in its very complex transfigurations, and in what it is doing. Now I want to go to the illiberalism debate. And when you look at the whole discussion about the rise of the right and the rise of the populist right in the West, then it seems to me that the immigration figure has become ever bigger about it. So when we were writing, this is actually before 2011, so when we were writing Headlines of Nation, Subtext of Class, that is 2008, 2009, that we were writing it. So it was actually in the middle of financial crisis. So in a way, as you say, it was very anticipatory. But that was because we were actually, many, working on Eastern Europe. And from there, moving into Western Europe and Southern Europe too. Darrell's paper that you were talking about. At that point in time, explanations of the rise of right-wing populism were not yet so hegemonized by the immigration figure. I mean, in Europe, we had the massive immigration out of post-Yugoslavia in the mid-90s. But by the early 2000s, immigration was really not alarming, nor was it politically manipulated very much. There was still, some stuff going on, sure. But it looked like there had been a rise of the new right in the late 1990s. But let us say around 2003, 2004, it looked like it sort of was ebbing away. Even though, of course, there was the Iraq War, there was anti-Islam, that was coming up. But in the explanation of the rise of the new right in the early 2000s, I don't think that immigration played such a big role. Now, of course, after 2004, it was in particular Eastern Europe where this was happening. There were no immigrants. There were emigrants. And this is actually something that is very little discussed on Central and Eastern Europe. But there is a very interesting connection between the rise of the new right and emigration. Not immigration in the East European cases. We can leave that for the discussion. But over time, the immigration symbol has become the key symbol by which the rise of right is being explained. Even though, of course, liberalism knows that it has been dispossessing a lot of people, that there is inequality, people are angry about it, they know that. Nevertheless, the electoral wins are steadily more explained by immigration and xenophobia. You see that in the work of Cas Mudde. Cas is another Dutch guy in the US, very well exposed, political scientist. So even though he was at CEU, like me at some point, and working on Eastern Europe, so he's aware of the complexities of the rise of the right and dispossession. Nevertheless, in his last book, it's just out, it's very clear. Immigration and xenophobia are the explanation for the electoral win of Trump and the UK and so on. Now, if you move a little bit further in the literature, then another explanation is basically a contingency explanation. So Jan Werner Müller, liberal theorist, Princeton, basically says, look, I mean, liberalism doesn't need to lose these fights. It was only, it was only bad luck. We didn't do it well. We weren't self-conscious enough. He's rallying the liberal mind. We're fighting a war finally again. Because, after 1989, there was no war for liberalism. They had won already. But now, finally, a reason to war again. That is basically what Jan Werner Müller is telling everybody. Mike Davis in the US, totally different figure, of course, also analyzes the rise of Trump in terms of contingencies. He basically says, look, it's a few 100,000 votes. He's right about that. Right about it. But it is, I think, not very smart. But it's good that he's right about it, because it also means that, a left liberalism can again win. Yes, we can. Right? Certainly, yeah. But it is not smart to deny the deeper tendencies underlying the rise of the right, of populist liberalism. The deeper tendencies are everywhere. They are in the global scene. They are about China. They're about the rise of all sorts of, well, Branko Milanovic calls them political capitalisms. They are liberal political capitalisms, not left-wing political capitalisms. What does it mean when you say that class is the absent presence and the present absence, lurking in the background of the rise of the right? It basically means, and I link up here with what Donatella said before, it basically means understanding the rise of the right in terms of the switching off of the left, the self-switch off of the left, the absence of a radical critique among social democrats, but also, the green left, the absence of a radical critique on creeping processes of dispossession over time, the loss of hope, disenfranchisement, demoralization, devaluation. We need to sort of, when we talk about class and labor, we need to start to get these terms. Devaluation is a very important term. I mean, every good capitalist would normally immediately know what it means to devalue a proletariat. Why is it so hard for the left to understand that? So those are processes that precede immigration. And they hit in combined and uneven ways whole spaces, not just working classes. But they are about class, they are about devaluation, they are about dispossession, they are about disenfranchisement. And within those processes, something happens that Jonathan Friedman in anthropology has called double polarization. Now, double polarization is an important concept. I've been working a lot with it, and it's in the introduction to that bundle that Linus likes so much. Now, in Friedman's vision, now watch out with Jonathan Friedman. Jonathan is an important Marxist anthropologist, one of those on whose shoulders my generation has built. But Jonathan is also a celebrated icon in the Scandinavian right, without him wanting that necessarily. That is because he was already in the early 1990s basically sort of anticipating the emergent right-wing ideologies about a cosmopolitan class that leaves the obligations of the nation and the duties of the nation, citizenship of the nation, becomes cosmopolitan capitalist class, identifying only with human rights, not with civil rights, not with social rights. That is seen as being opposed. No, I should say that is seen in being in an alliance with a dangerous class of immigrants, human rights, and dangerous classes of surplus populations like the Roma, relative surplus populations. And that cosmopolitan class in that dangerous coalition with the subaltern is basically out at dispossessing the folk, the people, the formerly Fordist working classes, including the formerly Fordist administrators, bureaucrats, educated white middle classes. Well, that figure is exactly the so. Friedman anticipated this, and he stuck out his neck. And that is indeed the figure that over time in the 90s and the 2000s crystallized into a biting right-wing ideology, which you can find back in many different guises, from right-wing Poland to a liberal Hungary, to anywhere in the Balkans, to France, to the Netherlands, to the UK and the US. Again, class is the absent presence and the present absence lurking in the background of this, right? These are the processes of dispossession and disenfranchisement that produce this ideological figure inevitably. It's about the globalization of capital, it's about the class war from above, and it's about how the national, social democratic, Christian democratic, liberal states of the post-war period are being unmade into highly polarized relational sites. Now, this is not right. So hence the white working class. That's where the white working class figure is rooted in these processes. Now, of course, there's nothing white about working class. And there's a lot of white also about the middle class. Luke Crowells and others, political scientists, have done this nice research in the UK where they basically argue that the core of the pro-Brexit vote are basically educated working classes who imagine themselves to be middle classes, right? This is, of course, a historical figure. It's exactly the classes that in the 1920s and 1930s aligned with fascism and the right. The early Frankfurt School was really eloquent on this, right? Here, of course, it's interesting to talk about Marx and Weber and Polanyi, I should say. And now I improvise a little because I just think this might be important and interesting for all of us. Look, for me, I have a perfectly Marxist concept of the working class. Everybody who needs to sell his labor or her labor is working class. That is the Marxian concept of the working class, period. Well, then Marx has a little bit of writing, of course, about the new middle class that was emerging from the 1860s onwards. So the administrators, the lieutenants and the sergeants of the capitalists, right? And the state class. But state class was still at that point very much aristocratic, don't forget that. But this is basically the Marxist conception of the working class. Now, I think we are all workers. That is, I think, the sort of default position when we talk class. Under capitalism, you have capital, I have the working class. Now, working class exploited. And we are forced into exploitation because we cannot live without. We cannot survive, we cannot reproduce over time without selling our labor. Now, how we do that is entirely open. And we might well do our best to educate us very well and then be a little bit happy or make very smart choices and do IT or something and actually get a little bit rich even. You might actually become capitalist. You might certainly well become middle class. Those positions still exist, fortunately. Nevertheless, in my vision and in Marx's vision, I would say these are working class people. Now, but here's where Weber comes in. And of course Bourdieu too. Bourdieu is a late welfare state update to Weber, in my eyes. Where Weber comes in. And Weber would say, all those who lift themselves up from, or imagine themselves to be lifted up from a working class, that is a political struggle. That is about getting privileges. That is about creating in-group and hoarding and credentialization. Those are Weberian processes, but they happen within capitalism and they affect the working class. They divide the working class, right? So class formation is very much about this Marxian Weberian dialectic over time, and it's all about emergences, and it's all about these stormy moments where at once the middle classes realize that they are just fucked as well. They're just working classes like everybody else. Those are the revolutionary moments. Or in any case, part of the working class, of the middle classes. Where they start to see that they have been manufactured by states and by prestige into thinking that they were something else, but they are not really something else, right? So that is actually nice about, it's pity that Mike is not here, Mike Savage's work. That Mike basically shows that, look, you know, you have these 6% who are the elite for him. For me, they are the capitalist class. For him, they are the elite. He doesn't talk Marxism. But then you have this 94% who is basically the worker. Then you have all these segmentations. Mike's problem is that he calls all these 5 groups within those 94% classes. Right? My point would be, very simple and Marxist, these are the workers. All of them. And now we get the Weberian game going. Now, but I want to say a few words more about Polanyi, because Polanyi, of course, very interesting as a welfare state theorist. But more importantly, and perversely for our purposes, is that Polanyi doesn't really analyze class. He analyzes the counter movement. The counter movement of those who defend themselves against the disembedding of the economy. He means capital, he means the globalization of capital. And those who are defending themselves in the counter movement against the disembedding of the economy are for him not necessarily working class, right? They are, it's not clear what they are. Well, here is, in my view, the clue to the rise of the illiberal. Polanyi gives a very strong clue here. These are counter movements. These are not class movements. These are counter movements against the globalization of capital. They want to bring back the national caring welfare state. Here's also Jonathan Friedman, because they are nostalgic, right? Friedman argues that in the double polarization, the formerly Fordist working class who were progressive and had hope for a future and were futuristic oriented, they become nostalgic. Well, there's a lot of writing about nostalgia now. The whole UK calamity is explained in terms of nostalgia, as you know. Well, those are Polanyian, Friedmanian moments, right? So the loss of a future, the recapturing of a golden past. I would say that Marx, Weber, and Polanyi are really great authors to play with, and I think there's for us much to learn. Now, what is class? The third part, and I'm going to speed up. How much time do we still have? 10 minutes?
A lot.
Oh, a lot? Oh, we have a lot. Okay, yeah, but these people, you know, I'm exploiting them. What is class? Let me go very fast and very simple. There is something, of course, called economic class. Now, a recent example of writing about economic class is Vivek Chibber's piece in Catalyst. Chibber, you know Chibber, the post-colonial theorist. Chibber is important because Chibber is one of the key intellectuals in New York for the Democratic Socialists, which have 60,000 members now in and around New York in particular. And he's their key guy. And Catalyst was the sort of new journal that expressed the rise of a new left, within sociology in particular. Now, he has this article in Catalyst, which is a refutation of the cultural turn. I would say it's a little bit late to do that, but okay. And Chibber basically says, look, you know, class is economic class. And economic class basically means that the working class is compelled to sell its labor power. The classic Marxian argument. And so he said, you know, what about the cultural turn? Yes, I know, he says. You know, the cultural turn has taught us that everything that exists must also be signified first in culture. But whether or not this is signified, he says, the working class has to sell its labor power. That's economic class. It's compulsion. Well, that's a crisp argument. As an anthropologist, I say, this is important. But it is only one thing, right? Economic class is important, inevitably. That's also why I'm a Marxist. But this is not, I think, the sort of complexity that we need in order to get at class as this absent, present, absent thing. Chibber cannot really explain with the paper that he does there why there are not strikes going on everywhere. Now, in sociology, and I guess in social movement studies, you talk about social classes. These tend to be categories rather than classes. Emergent solidarity is a possibility, not a necessity, for it to be called social class. And I think from the anthropological point of view, the important thing here is that these are already crystallized classes. They exist as classes, social classes. Now, the anthropology of class, so let me say, against economic class and sociological class, anthropological class is, I think, very much about classes that do not really exist yet as such, and that might become existent in a particular way that we cannot predict entirely. Right? That is anthropological class. So it's very hybrid, it's very pussy, it's more class in itself, if you like, than class for itself, let alone class of itself. I mean, class of itself is for me the capitalist position. We have no problem with in or for itself. They are of itself. But all the other classes are a potentiality, nothing more. Yes, they are always an economic class somehow, but we're all compelled to sell our labor power, but not necessarily to capitalists. There's many people in the world who don't sell their labor power to a capitalist. Anthropological class is deeply relational, and I want to expand a little bit about that. So, and I actually built a lot on this great anthropologist, Charles Tilly. And in fact, when I was writing my expanding class book, I was close to Tilly, and Tilly was writing his durable inequality book. And Tilly was, of course, a major figure. I was only a beginner, and so I was very happy with that alliance. But Tilly was also very happy with the alliance, and he took that word, relational explanation, from what I was writing. So I'm a little bit proud of that. Now, relational class, the simplest way to understand that is to see that class is about the myriad set of relationships, vertical and horizontal, exploitation, extraction, solidarity and support, that you and I enter into day after day in order to reproduce our lives. That is how I developed my class concept in expanding class, and that is how Tilly later took it over. In particular, also very well articulated in this little piece that he wrote for the new journal Anthropological Theory, The Relational Origins of Social Inequality. It's not a very often quoted piece, but it is a very perceptive one. And it helps you a lot in thinking through, paradoxically with a great sociologist, the emergent anthropological concept of class. Now, those relations that we need to enter into day after day in order to reproduce our lives are of very heterogeneous nature. They are combined and uneven. Not all of us are the same in that respect, but we all need to work, we all need to care, we all need to educate ourselves or our children. It's about health, it's about the urban. We all need to live in spaces. We need to have access to spaces. We have all sorts of cultural, relational resources, etc. Now, so it's not just about work, and it's not just about labor, even though, of course, work and labor are very important moments because we all need to sell our labor power. But in order to get at what is really happening at the ground of class, so to speak, you need to get to that everyday level of social reproduction. And when I say social reproduction, I am not entirely making a full bow to the feminists of social reproduction. I say this openly, because they tend to equate it with their work and with the family. I don't even think that it's only their work, and the family is certainly not the only site of social reproduction. Social reproduction is what we all do with each other all the time. Yes, unequally distributed, certain tasks all the time, and certain fruits also all the time. Now, but it is that relational approach to class, and that is where, of course, ethnography becomes important, or in any case, qualitative research becomes important, that allows us to understand the sort of developments, practice, the relationships on the ground. And certainly when you follow this, when you follow everyday social reproduction, over time, changes become visible, right? So all the work that I have done, all the work that I think is now being done in anthropology on relational class is deeply temporal, right? So you're talking about 1 or 2 generations, ideally. And you want to really bring change, dispossession, disenfranchisement, devalorization, devaluation, etc. into the picture. And again, capital is now moving out of the space of production into the city, into social reproduction in many forms. If states are, if the policy of states, national states, is primarily determined at this moment in time by state indebtedness, states become debt collection agencies for capital. That's the sort of states that we're seeing. That drives developments in health and education. These are class struggles, right? And we meet them on an everyday level, all the time. Some of the revenues of capital, the super revenues of capital, come back to us in the form of loans, and come back to our public sectors in the forms of loans. Well, at the moment they're very cheap, as we know. That's very nice, thank you very much, simply because there is an enormous surplus of capital going on. But nevertheless, these are, again, exploitative, extractive moments. And so class really, in the contemporary context, is going in all these nooks and crannies of everyday social reproduction, everyday life, and find its extractive and exploitative moments. And they are endless, I would say. Now, watch out with Antonio Negri. Negri is great in seeing the city itself as the factory, right? So that's basically the move that Negri and the post-operaismo authors and that are doing. I think that's important stuff. Yes, capital has moved out, and the proletariat has moved out of the factory. It's everywhere. But of course, Negri is very, very weak in the very particular sociological relationships of that process. And so while that is the big tendency, it hits different people differently. Different actors, groups, status groups can insert themselves differently within that process. So it's about common exploitations, common extractions. It's about status distinctions and deservingness notions within that. And it's about the potentiality for solidarity to emerge against all of that, within and against all of that. And then, of course, the stormy moments. What happens in the stormy moments? We cannot anticipate that. But what we can certainly do is understand the tendencies. Now, I want to say I would just finish with my recent research on Romania. Romania is not a key case of illiberalism in Eastern Europe, fortunately. It's, in fact, a very interesting and, in many ways, I would also say, happy place, politically. Dynamic. But I'm now working on IT workers in Cluj. And I call my project The Contradictions of the Creative Class in Europe. Cluj is one site. I want to have urban case studies in this. Cluj is one site. There will be an Italian case study starting very soon. And I will go back to Eindhoven in the Netherlands for the third. So Northwestern Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. I don't believe that the creative classes will be necessarily the drivers of the next revolution, right? Which is what you would conclude if you read Antonio Negri. Now, the people that I've been talking to and interviewing in Cluj are certainly not a radical revolutionary class. They are very enlightened and very liberal, and in many ways also quite leftist class. But they cannot organize. They're deeply exploited. They don't have fixed labor contracts. They are kept out of the national welfare system very consciously. They themselves want that because it gives them more cash. And there's two things that basically typify them. First, they are still completely surprised that all of this is happening to them. They don't need to emigrate. They don't need to become construction workers in the West or in Moscow. And they don't need to become family carers in Italy. They can actually study, go abroad, and come back to Cluj and have an income. Now, that's a surprise to them, really. They can't believe that this is happening. So that is not a very revolutionary ground, as you can understand. There's a lot of gratefulness. At the same time, there's a keen awareness of how fickle this all is. Top players in that market. So Cluj has a labor market of about 150,000 people. More than 20% is now already in IT. And that has all been happening in the last 5 years. Right? So this is a massive process. Now, Cluj is not special in this, in fact. Well, Cluj is a little bit special, but this is happening all over Europe, all over Eastern Europe, right? So the new industrializations in Eastern Europe are partly, of course, fixed capital, Bosch, and so on, but much of it is outsourced business services, including IT. Now, and that is true from Poznan to Krakow, to Cluj, to Bulgaria and Serbia, etc., etc. So it's important to see that this is outsourced. So these are transnational capitalists who are doing that. They can be big and small. What they pay in Cluj is anywhere between, well, 300 euros. For the top players, 3,000 euros. And then you have, of course, the IT artisans. From Romania, this is a country with a lot of really good mathematics teaching. And so they have a lot of educated IT people who go for a while to Silicon Valley and come back and they just live in Cluj and they have $10,000 a month, right? But basically it's between 300 and 3,000, and 3,000 the absolute top. It's a very pyramidal structure, very high, very sort of vertical, and most people are somewhere between 500 and 800 euros a month. We all know that prices in Eastern Europe are just as high as in Western Europe, except for housing, but in Cluj that is not even true. And we all know that 800 euros is below the Western poverty lines, right? So that is the sort of proletariat that is so happy to see itself actually employed in very flexible contexts. Even top players tell me, look, we know that we compete with India, and we are now actually 20% more expensive than India. They can leave tomorrow. They know that. And so the thing that I'm doing, says this top human resource manager to me, who is just a great girl, anarchist, very educated, very traveled, great eye for people, and she says, I earn as much as I can, pay off all my debts if I can, and then whatever happens. Might be tomorrow, might be 3 or 4 years. So that's the sort of proletariat you're dealing with. Not very revolutionary. Very nice people, all of them, and very happy, and very exploited. Now, when you look at the Romanian scene, what about the Romanian working class? At the same time that I'm doing this research, there are 19 big strikes going on in Romania. They're all strikes by organized industrial workers. There is very little in the media about it. Politics doesn't care. And my IT working class knows about it, talks about it, and that's it. Those are people who have organizations, who have solidarity, and could extend it. There's, of course, another working class. There are 3 working classes, I would say, in Romania. You have the new creative classes. These are young people, they're all below 35. You have the industrial working class, which is all over the ages, and it's not in the bigger cities, it's in the smaller cities. And then you have, of course, the old, largely dispossessed, completely devalued working classes in the countrysides, above 50 years old. Right? This is why I think that Eastern Europe is an avant-garde situation, because it shows so well the fragmentations in such a clear sense, and the identity politics that can be built on the fragmentations if solidarity is not forthcoming. So, in the same year that I'm doing research in Romania, there is the family referendum going on. Of course, pushed by Putin and the Orthodox Church. The family referendum is a referendum that asks people to vote for a change in the constitution that the family, the official family, is only between a real man and a real woman. Well, you know about all these things. Identity politics. Of course, the old, devalued, dispossessed proletariat in the countrysides vote for the family referendum. The working classes that are striking don't vote. And the IT creative classes vote against the referendum. And they hate each other for it, right? That's identity politics in action. In fact, the creative classes in Cluj and in Bucharest make a political advertisement campaign against the family referendum in favor of free sex. Well, very nice. There you have it. I agree with you, but politically speaking, you go nowhere. In the same year that I was doing this research, there is an effort to create a new left-wing party. As you know, Social Democrats in Romania are in fact the illiberal right. This is a new situation as compared to Hungary and to Poland. There's a new left-wing party in the making, and it's called Demos. And there is some promise. There is intellectual investment, there are really good people involved. They can actually mobilize quite a few people in constituencies in Bucharest, in Cluj, in the other creative cities. And they really want to span out into the countryside and to create a broad left. First official meeting of this party, I was a little bit involved as a speaker and as a sort of first official meeting of the board of this party. The minds completely split. It's a complete division. And the division, of course, is about identity politics. So there is a strong segment in the board that wants a person on the list who is a woman, a Roma, immigrant, and a sex worker. And she is widely accessible on the internet as a sex worker. That is a problem for another part of the board of this new left-wing party. And they say, well, she should take her websites as a sex worker down in order for her to be on the board of a political party. That creates mayhem, that discussion, and the party has been paralyzed for a couple of months after that, since then. And people are hugely angry at each other. So class as the unspoken thing behind the capacities to solidarize, the incapacities to solidarize, the exploitation and dispossessions that lie behind it, class in the anthropological sense. And I think I stop at this.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Don, for this very rich talk. And yeah, I would say we go directly into the discussion. Maybe first questions directly addressed to Don, and then we get more and more general, perhaps.
Thank you. First, a small comment of appreciation, because as someone that wants to be an anthropologist, I guess here, I'm really thankful that you're here and that you reminded us all about the durable inequality of Tilly and not only repertoires and social movements of Tilly. And my question is not really about class, but more about your first comments on the problem of liberalism. And the question is, when we are talking about the problems of liberalism and the death of liberalism, etc., how do we counteract Putin's comments about the death of liberalism? Well, when he is saying on world forums that the liberal idea is dead and it's expired itself and we have to go on, well, and he doesn't openly state we have to go on with totalitarian or illiberal ideas, but like when people like Putin, politicians like Putin, push forward these kinds of ideas. Thank you.
Shall I immediately answer?
Maybe let's collect.
Hi, Don Cinzia Padovani, Southern Illinois University, now here. I wanted to ask you something about the far right. I completely agree with your analysis that immigration is just a sort of a last. I'm following Casa Pound Italia, for instance. They set up their immigration manifesto only in 2013, and they have been active since the late 1990s. What is the class behind this visibility of what I define actually ultra-right or the neo-fascist right? Is that the capitalist class that is behind them? Because something that I noticed by studying them is that they do an excellent anti-capitalist critique. They use Antonio Gramsci better than many of us on the left, and they do hegemony analysis, a lot of cultural work, and use of media, that you mentioned, the liberal media as well. So, thank you.
I'm curious whether you would agree with the argument that the move towards illiberalism in Eastern Europe is perhaps making explicit something that was already there in liberalism beforehand. Because I know that in the U.S. context, at least, there are a lot of critical, especially coming from African American thinkers and other people from marginalized communities in the US context, that with the condemnation of Trump, there's a sense that somehow before this, that everyone was included in a liberal project. And so there's a sense that the argument that there's been a shift towards illiberalism is in fact missing the fact that illiberalism was there from the beginning. Illiberalism was included within liberalism from the beginning.
Shall I do these three? Yeah? I start with the Putin question. Yeah. Well, they are actually related, these two questions. I think this is a terrible dilemma for us. And it's also related to the Gramsci issue. I do think that the illiberal right does a terribly good job. I mean, why the fuck can't we do this? Look, perhaps the association of the left historically in Europe with liberalism was entirely predicated on an alliance that could produce democracy in 1918. And then welfare state. But is there an inevitable and essential alliance between the left and liberalism? That's a question that I think the current context forces upon us. I was in China in the beginning of the year for a month, doing research and giving talks. Yes, China is of course a very illiberal state. It's not a tyranny, unless you are an Uyghur, but for all others it is not. It does a lot of things very well for its people, very well. Better than basically any other state has done historically. It does a lot of things very badly. And people are very deeply exploited. There's no doubt about it. But the fact that China is still running a post-Maoist, I know it's not public, it's a state economy, but it could be a public economy, right? It could be a left-wing public economy, don't forget that. The fact that liberalism in the West and the alliance between the left and liberalism in the West forces us to be entirely pro-market and pro-private markets, that we cannot think about public organizations anymore. That our railways have to be dismantled and privatized, and the water, etc., 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 because that is the EU, and we must be in favor of the EU. All of that is fucking nonsense. And our problem is, on the left, with China, is yes, we must be against the authoritarianism, but there is a lot of things that we also should learn, right? Not from Putin. So that is sort of the landscape in which my mind moves when you pose a question like this. Nevertheless, Putin very regularly hits the nail on the head. Right? It's also when he talks about problems in liberalism and capitalism, he is actually very sharp. And we should not reject it out of hand, except that we don't want to work with him. right? Well, and then the other thing about liberalism and illiberalism, so the assumption that working classes were always already liberal. I think there's at the moment quite a lot good anthropological work coming out that points out precisely that, the opposite, right? That if you are at the receiving ends of labor markets and the state, and a growing percentage of people in all our post-welfare states is, then there is very liberal in the everyday environment in which you reproduce yourself. And it is not a surprise that these people might actually be in favor of continued illiberalism, but now in favor of them, punishing somebody else than them, right? So this is an important issue. The assumption that working classes have always already been incorporated in liberalism in the West, I think, is mistaken. But there was always already about 20% of the working class in the 50s and 60s that was really managed in a deeply illiberal, culturally derogating way. And we know that. And that percentage has only grown. So I think that is the answer to that too. Which again sort of inspires my doubts about liberalism. Right? So I've always said, also in Eastern Europe, in political meetings, you know, because you have all this, you know, this East European left who want to be liberal and pro-EU. There's a lot of deep problems there. And the beginning of learning to be left might well be the historical negation of this association. Of course, Zizek would immediately say, he's right to me now. But if Zizek says it to me, I get scared. Yeah, did I answer your questions enough? Good.
Actually, I would also like to ask a question, and then afterwards. Going back to Tilly, because you mentioned him, he has these two mechanisms of inequality, exploitation, and closure. And it seemed to me
which
that...
Which is the Marxian and the Weberian.
Exactly, yeah. Which I think is also a very nice kind of frame of mind for this conference, because there are some Weberians here, including maybe myself. So I think you know, this is something that needs to come together. So also in this sense, the way I understand you was that you were describing a lot of mechanisms that on this exploitation axis that essentially are global, dispossession, devaluation, and so on, and that connect working people, or like people who are exploited through their labor. And on the other hand, you were bringing in the closure element, the Weberian element, and the way I would understand it, also on two axes. On the one hand, closure by the nation state, so the differentiation of categories of workers by their nationality, and on the other hand, through institutions like the firm, but also the welfare state and so on, which differentiate the middle class from the working class. So basically what I wanted to ask you is what you see going in this particular historical conjuncture now that may overcome those kinds of horizontal elements of closure. And one comment to what you just said now, I think for the second type of closure, one way to overcome this was always a politics of class alliance, and I think most prominently social democracy. And I think this is where the necessity of liberalism for the left came from, because liberalism was always very strong among the middle classes, and social democracy integrated the middle classes concerns with the working class concerns. So I think there is a continued necessity actually of liberalism in order to build these kinds of alliances. But maybe even more interestingly, what would be the forces maybe that could tend to overcome the national type of closure between working people?
Can I take you back to your previous discussion? Going back to this thing about the rise of the far right, I noticed a phrase you mentioned as you were speaking. You mentioned the switching off of the left. I was wondering whether this is an inevitable process, or is it related to class? Because in a sense, class is related to it. Its class formation is caused by whether the left is going to, by the performance of the left in a way, rather than the opposite, but it is a question, is related, the switching off business, which gives to the far right the opportunity to re-articulate and tell lies about immigration. And I love this element about Eastern Europe, you know, the rise of the far right in Eastern Europe before immigration. So is it related to class? Is it sociological in other sense? Is it anthropological? Or is it political? How can we research this bureaucratization process, which is something which is independent in itself? I mean, it's not a reflection of class balances. Perhaps it's a reflection of ideational balances, as you said, the way we understand the future, sort of the way we conceive of socialism. How can that be, you know, combined with democracy rather than liberal democracy or liberalism and so on, which are all political themes, you know.
Yeah, these are already big questions, but so perhaps we should do them now. Start with the last one. We should not forget that the decline of social democracy is a worldwide phenomenon, or in any case a west-wide plus east phenomenon. That teaches us something. So very particular contingent conditions do not matter that much. They can turn it around for a little bit, but over time, over the last 30 years, everywhere, social democracy has either crumbled, evaporated, switched itself off. It is the flip side of the globalization of capital, first of all, right? So if you want, that's an economic answer, but that's a very anthropological answer too. So from the moment that within national welfare states, you cannot claim any further rights or rewards from capital because it has globalized. Very little space for national social democracy. Right? And that is what we have been seeing over time. The EU formation process is a more complex form of exactly the same, where the EU itself uses its budget stipulations, etc., to actually slim down welfare states systematically over time. So the EU is, in a way, it's a turbo globalization of capital, a more complex form of the globalization of capital, of allowing capital to escape the national welfare state cage than even the global one. Then, of course, you have, over the last 40 years, massive differentiation process, a Weberian differentiation process, where the intellectuals increasingly have really very different trajectories than the lower skilled working classes. That was not so in the 60s and 70s. And so over time, I guess, even the preached socialism of the intellectuals became a lie in many ways, or in any case something to be perceived by the lower educated working classes as something that was not entirely credible, not really for them. So it's the internal differentiations of neoliberalism, class differentiations of neoliberalism, that also play a big role here. Then, of course, 1989, the collapse of socialism worldwide. So it's a totally overdetermined, I would say, process. Now, if I say it like this, it might sound pretty hopeless. I don't want it to sound like that. I do believe in the stormy moments, and I actually have a book out about the worldwide mobilizations too, right? I do believe in the stormy moment and the possibility of creating new class formations and solidarities and political creativity, stormy political creativity. But let me also say this. Until now, I think all of us have also been rather disappointed about that. We should also probably be honest about that. So even though we might have hope against this massive, overdetermined global local process over time that destroys social democracy and that destroys the chances for class solidarities and produces the illiberal white working class sort of figure over time. We should remain hopeful, but we should also probably be skeptical. I am afraid that many of the mobilizations that we're seeing and the political creativity that emerges from it is an effort to recapture the welfare state of the 70s. But that thing is gone and it won't come back, is my bottom line here. We're also living in a completely different space by now in terms of capitalism, in terms of how capitalism works. Not only the big global divides that might turn into Cold Wars, but also capital and finance, quantitative easing, the simple abundance of capital. So we are now in a situation where there's an abundance of capital and an abundance of labor. We had exactly the same in the early 1930s. The national welfare state emerged in order to set that capital and that labor to work, to let them both be valorized. Where is our vision for how to do that now? It can't be done on a national state level anymore, even though the right wants that. But the right might be right that there can be done more on the national level, right? And that is, of course, also the space that the left needs to grab. We need to do more than the right does. And the right thinks rather than the purely protective and symbolic things. I mean, coming back to Eastern Europe again, you probably know that in Poland, the right has now institutionalized a set of family-oriented welfare benefits that are huge, right? All the neoliberal economies were against it. The World Bank were against it. But they fucking did it. Where has been the left-wing government that simply did it in Europe against the World Bank and the economists? And they did it. Even more. The left rejected them, right? And still, I mean, I'm talking to my Polish interrogator, and I tell you, the left has to overdo this, right? So not make it a pro-family, but a universalized sort of system. But these benefits are something that people have been craving for. It's what brings them back to Poland, including, of course, the employment now. And people are really, so the right has been able to build a very strong historical bloc in places like Hungary and in Poland in particular, because it was much more labor-driven right than in Hungary. Hungary was a racist right from the start, but not without a clear idea that the average Magyar was exploited, right? That is the issue also for the Hungarian right. So, this is where the left needs to be able to speak a much clearer language. Come with a program, actually just do it, whatever everybody else says. But that might also mean that, the professors are going to pay higher taxes and all these things. I mean, the differentiation between the intellectuals and the lower educated people is still there, even though, of course, increasingly, fortunately in a way, politically speaking, the intellectuals are also becoming totally precaritized. And this is probably where I need to link it with your question. Yeah, so I mean, national welfare state, but also social democratic welfare states have been massive machines for the institutionalization of class distinctions. Social democracy has not escaped that. Of course, the Christian democratic cases are stronger than the social democratic cases, but nevertheless, they have done it everywhere, right? And I would even say that some of the Christian democratic states, when you look at Belgium, where I live, that is a very Christian democratic welfare state where you can actually still speak about the working class as the working class, but then all the others are administrators or servants of the state, or they have a completely different category. In the Netherlands, which is social democratic welfare state historically, not anymore, it's not a welfare state anymore, as you know, formally speaking, like Hungary, right? There's two places in Europe that have cancelled their own welfare states. That's Orban, Hungary, and that's Rutte, the Netherlands. That's very interesting. one in a purely neoliberal way, the other in a purely neoliberal way, but there's a lot of illiberalism in the Netherlands too, behind that. Because they think that those who do not work are undeserving, right? So there's a lot of illiberalism there too. But of course the precaritization that is going to happen also with automation and with artificial intelligence and all of this in the next 20 years, which may be not as massive as is now sometimes projected. That's what we historically know, right? It's never as bad as the actual projections. But it will be massive enough, perhaps. And so I guess there will be an increasing irrelevance of the historical distinction categories of the 20th century welfare states. When I say this, I am not predicting that people will not entirely cling to them because of the very same reason, right? So again, this is open and it's about politics. In the end, this is all about politics.
Vocabulary of crisis, of multi-dimensional crisis, and especially the refugee and migration crisis, is changing really the rules of class formation. For instance, the concept, the term, the social category, vulnerable, how it intervenes this conceptualization of describing the new social category of refugees or for migrants in the workplace or in the distribution of income, of European income to be clear, how these intervene in the imaginary of the class, of the national class, of the common workers, and how all this new industry of conceptualizations around, in order to describe the newcomers in the local communities, really provokes an interclass parcellization in ontological terms, finally. Because what means, we can understand precarious worker, but what means vulnerable in the workplace or in a social urban space? And what about to challenges intellectuals, all these industry of words, of meaningful notions that aim to divide more deeply the class community or the class solidarities and all of this. And on the other side, I was thinking that this ongoing interclass parcellization can explain perhaps why the figure of the resistance now is not a class figure, you know, in strict terms, in very strict terms, but it's all this young, all this youth, that this precarious worker, is immigrant, is of course people without any kind of hope or ambition of social distinction in, you know, Bourdieuian terms, but perhaps all this embarrassment around the social figure of the new resistant figure is explained by this process of ongoing parcellization of classes and exploited people.
Yes, I think I have some general questions that may reopen also the debate on our interaction and the different points of view. I since the very beginning also of your presentations, I was thinking about the general questions that will be relevant also for the rest of the conference about which moment in this capitalism development are we in? The sense that you talked about perpetual returning of 2011 movements, but at the same time we also know that movements tend to change and that their changes reflect also the structural transformations if they are eventful, stormy moment. So already when we study social movements, just focusing on the new millenniums, we distinguish the different characteristics of the movements in the beginning of the millennium, the global justice movements and the global wave of protest from the 2011 movements, because I think the first represented the opposition to neoliberal capitalism in the rampant moment of neoliberal capitalism. 2011 was the reactions to austerity policies and the type of, reactions to that, in which there was a little bit of Polanyi even on the left. So it was not just counter movement on the right, but it was claims to defend all the rights. So there was already looking in the past and in the future, which is also often common. So now the questions that I think is a question for the whole conference is what is this moment of? Because the impression is, we didn't study it yet, but the impression is that the movements of 2019 are reflecting something else than the austerity policies. Of course, they reflect a moment which is no longer a moment of sudden crisis, but of the sedimentation of something. Colin Kraut said, the strange non-disappearance of neoliberalism after it proved unable to provide for growth. And I thought maybe in this illiberal type conceptions, there is also something telling about the forms of this third wave of movements that are reacting to transformations in capitalism, and I think it would be useful to explore this also in the rest of the conference. So if we are facing new waves of protest with some new characteristics, it also refers to some type of transformations in capitalism with what is neoliberalism now. It's no longer the rampant moment, but it is also no longer just the peak of a crisis. It's some reactions of the capitalist class to the protest of the 2011 with the closures and so on. But I think it is an important open question. And the other questions I had is about the global trajectories, but also I would say some defense of some methodological nationalism is still useful. Because I think that in the reactions that we see now, nation states are not overcome by a global wave. Sure. So we still have the presence of specific conditions in terms of the political opportunities, traditions of specific countries and specific areas. And also what we notice is in terms of traditions of social movements. What the type of reactions of movement is different. And in this, the final point that I wanted to address is the fact that we, from the political point of view, we see also some transformations, even visible in very recent elections, like the last European elections, in directions of fragmentations of the potential alliance of the left, but also maybe potential acknowledgement of the need to create alliances. And what we saw then and now we also tend to see is some transformations also in the center-left. So Corbyn, Sanders, but also beyond Sanders, the developments in these countries in which the center-left party seems more in crisis than everywhere else, but there is some changes. Some changes in Germany, some changes in Portugal, so slow move, but maybe an acknowledgement, political learning also. There is also something else. In the 2011, one tended to believe that some new movement parties could substitute for the crisis of the center-left parties. Syriza power, Podemos was almost there to overcome the PSOE. But what we see is that this didn't happen. So we have still strong challenges on the left, but also if we look at the local levels, the experiences where there was a successful resistance were experiences in which coalitions could be built. And notwithstanding the type of moments of the tensions that you have described. And finally, I think there is another thing that you mentioned. The Green have a lot of internal contradictions, but on the other hand, with the increasing awareness on environmental issues, and the stormy moment also about green politics that Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellions have produced, also there are some potential changes. So, and I think that also this is an issue that requires some moderate bit of methodological nationalism, because there are global trends, but also embedded in national.
I'll go fast. Well, yeah, of course, the nation state is still very important. Very powerful institution. It's a big problem, and it's a big possibility, right? So I wouldn't be methodologically nationalist, but I recognize that nation states are still very important. Globalization didn't do away with them, of course. But of course, the fact that certainly in Europe, we have this whole collection of super tiny nation states that actually compete with each other, that is a huge problem, right? And so as long as we in Europe cannot really produce a Brussels-focused Europe-wide public sphere, including a president and all these things, I'm actually quite skeptical. I tend to think that the left in Europe can only really revitalize if that new public space emerges, that Europe-wide public space. I'm afraid that the nation state will only invite defensive, parochial struggles and innovations. So yeah, so I'm a bit more on the cosmopolitan side here, I think. Yeah, I go there and I come back again. I think so I don't believe actually in the political creativity of the left and of the parties. I don't see it happening. I see a lot of ritual, but I don't see openings. Corbyn is something else. And the same is true for the Democratic left in the US. I mean, there are real breakthroughs there, including people's quantitative easing, and of course the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal has a lot of potential, but I think that most of the politics will emerge from the spasmodic rebellions, and then all the journalists will say these people have never been involved in politics. It's the first time that this is the sort of language that we get since about 2011 that will continue. So I foresee a world in the next 10-15 years with a lot of worldwide mobilizations that basically emerge around very tiny things. These few cents. Just think of Chile. These few cents for the metro, and then you have a massive nationwide uprising, angry. That is very interesting. In Hungary, the right basically emerged when people got finally very angry in a mobilization about the 2 cents that they were having to pay on their health insurance. Well, this is not historically correct, but it's more or less something like that. So you have these very little sparks that make people very angry because they are very disappointed already. And so that is where the contingencies interact with the long-term creepy processes that we need to map and to need to understand of dispossession, which happen over the differentiations, right? That is also so important to see. I think there is a very interesting, hybrid, contradictory, potentially quite violent, I must say, politics going on of deservingness on the one hand and the non-deservingness of others, and solidarity, because you recognize in each other's problems yourself. That is what I feel, and that is also, let us say, the sort of figure that allows me to have a hope, because there's also this potential for solidary imagination and identification and identity in that sense, solidary identities. But it is crisscrossed with strong senses of deservingness, and even my perfectly nice left-wing liberal IT workers in Cluj become very angry when it is about taxes. They don't want to pay taxes because they don't want to support all these people who are not working, who are their parents, right? And so it's that sort of stuff that's going on all the time. But then coming back so it will be the mass mobilizations that give the sparks, and that also produce the hope. It will be very difficult work to trace from them coherent political programs that are really progressive and not backward-looking. That work will probably not be done by the parties as we know them. I'm afraid that. But those spasmodic rebellions will be deeply contradictory in themselves. Take, for example, the green politics. Think of the Gilets jaunes. And I don't think that the Gilets jaunes will be an isolated example in the next 15 years. There is, of course, probably an intensifying attempt by the capitalist class and the states to put the costs of the inevitable green transition that they are facing, and they are facing it. They're now finally facing it. And they're panicking because they know they can't do it. And they also know that capitalism can't do it, right? So they're really panicking. But as long as they can postpone the awareness of capitalism can't do it, which is what they're trying to do, right? So still still technocratic mode, creating markets, carbon markets, and so on. But they know somewhere deeply that capitalism may not be able to do this. Anyhow, until that moment, they will try to push the costs of that whole thing onto others, right? There is no doubt about it. And the Gilets jaunes were a reaction against that. So there will be a lot of this very contradictory stuff going on, I think, in the next years, where states will increase the utility prices, the taxes on cars, etc. The Netherlands is now reducing maximum speed yesterday to 100. And that for the new Liberal Party, you know, which is the party of car owners. Let's see how this works out. But that will be the sort of day after day politics that will be going on around greenishness. It will be pushed onto the shoulders, in particular of those who have already been dispossessed over time. Yeah.
I think we should move to the last round of questions, if possible, very short, because now we actually filled the time that we had for the 4 keynotes, also with 2. So, yeah, Christopher still.
I tried to make it short. Thanks again for your 2 talks. I want to come back to the topic of new or liberalism Don Kalb mentioned in the first answer. Well, I totally follow you in that the connection between the left and liberalism has to be questioned, and that a radical left or left itself can't be pre-EU or something like that. But as far as I understood you, I found it quite dangerous to go all the way to China then, because then you forget the necessity of the connection between the left and liberation. And this brings me back to the first talk, because there was a lot about emerging of class struggles from the margin, the new practices, the new actions, the new forms of organization, and they all show that we don't need, well, a communist state like China, but we see that the people don't need to be represented by them at all. They don't need it. The riots or all the uprisings, they rarely have been planned or have been spontaneously, and all the existing parties and unions lag far behind, or even, well, have been completely made superfluous, and I think that's a good thing. So for a left or for emancipatorian class researchers as we are, maybe, I don't know, I think it's way more interesting to talk and to see the barricades that are burning in Chile right now than to see the Communist Party of China some kind of a role model or something like that.
I didn't say it's a role model. Come on. Did I say it was a role model? No, please. No, it's not a role model, not at all. But by the way, the Communist Party of China is the greatest collection of capitalists on earth. So you know, is this communist? No, it's not communist. But it has a very particular institutional and ideological heritage that makes it very interesting for us to look at how really successful capitalisms can emerge, right? Because this is the state. This is the only third world state. In 1989, the GDP of China was the same as Albania. No state has ever escaped its position like that, right? The only others are perhaps South Korea and Japan, but not like this. Not on such a scale that you can only be surprised and admire in revulsion. It is really like that. Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Chile is nice, but we've seen these things before. It's I'm not. No, I have friends, and you have friends, that every time there is a Chile going on somewhere, they cry out, and you know, now it's beginning. Now it won't be beginning.
I mean, I think we have to wait and see, but the impression is that, as Alessandro Pizzorno said, it is not that we can cry because of the end of classes. At any time there is a decline, and we cannot call any movement a successful revolutions. But I think we have still to wait and see, because what it seems to be the case is that we have a return of very different forms of movements, from Fridays for Future to the type of Chile, also Catalonia and so on. And I think that something that maybe is to be discussed is that the difference between the normative position and the observations of about what happened in the past. So you said I'm a cosmopolitan more than you. Well, now I don't think I wanted to. I wanted, yes, you. No, I didn't want to make a normative point, but just wanted to say that if we look at the past history, we see a lot, as you say, of hybrid type of identities. So we see that in the past also some territorial identities were linked with progressive politics. And what we see now is that there is a return not only of struggles on social issues, but also that there is in all these struggles a claim for self-determination, for different forms of democracy. The Gilets jaunes themselves called for direct forms of democracies. In Chile, during the heat of the storm, they are going back to assemblies at the local level. So I think these are type of transformations that we have to consider as potential triggers. Then I think also that there is an issue that needs to be reflected upon in order to understand the moment, and it is the fact that we have often different conceptions of the long historical wave that I think were referred to in the first part of the debate, and short type of transformations. And this, I think, is also something that is particularly relevant in a moment in which this type of waves are especially condensed, are very short, because they are intense and there is quick interactions. But I think it has been a very interesting morning.
Yeah, thanks to both of the keynote speakers. Maybe another round of applause. And we will now go to lunch. I don't know, did you all find the internet access in your thing here, like how you access the Wi-Fi? Because I sent you the updated program via email to all of you. But if you don't have access to internet or something, you can also come up here. I'll have it here on my computer if you want to have a look. Most of the panels have actually not changed, but a few have compared to this one. And just now, like I just sent it 15 minutes ago. And then at 3 o'clock we come back and we start with the first two panels. One will be here, the one on electoral politics, and the other one will be in the room called Polaiolo, but there will be a sign so you will see it. It's on the other side of the corridor here at the entrance.
We go for lunch together also with Linus, okay?
Gabor, you join us for lunch?
I'm here with my wife.
Bring your wife too. Yeah, he has a beautiful wife. Is she here?
She is at the hotel.
Okay. You're going? Yeah, we go for lunch with. I mean, everybody has lunch somewhere now. I'm inviting you in. If you want to.
Are you also going in the evening?
Yeah.
So it's not at the lunch then? Very inspiring.
Yeah, it was really
rare.
Yeah, I was really